Welcome to DF King's Proxy Insights Podcast Series. Michael Madalon, SVP Corporate Proxy, is your host for today's episode. He is joined today by his colleague, Zally Ahmadi, SVP of Corporate Governance, ESG, and Executive Compensation.
Today, we're going to give a high-level overview of the shareholder proposals that we saw in 2023, the numbers, the support levels, who the proponents were, and the issuers that they were targeting.
If you look at all proposals across the board, we saw about the same number of submissions, not a huge difference there from the previous year or the year before that, right? If we're looking at support levels, that's where we saw dips. That's kind of the main takeaway, I think, from this proxy season is that we're seeing much lower support levels in some instances. When we take shareholder proposals and separate it out into buckets, right, the E, the S, and the G, we get kind of a better look into what's happening in each one. So for environmental, we saw more proposals on ballots, but again, significantly less support in some instances, right? So that kind of overshadowed any increase that we saw in terms of proposals going to a vote. For social proposals, they were the number one category in terms of submissions. It's been that way for a couple years now. It makes sense. It's the broadest category. It has more topics in it, especially since the pandemic. There's been more of a focus on social topics as well, things like health, harassment, diversity, things like that. Anti-ESG falls under that social bucket, and that took about 10% of submissions this year, so that was interesting. For governance, nobody's really reinventing the wheel for governance here, right? So numbers are continuing to decline, not in alarming numbers by any means, but it's more or less the same of what we've been seeing. A new type of proposal we saw this year in governance, following those the universal proxy rules updates. So we saw a new type come in, asking for shareholder approval of bylaw amendments for advance notice provisions. I think one interesting thing as well is comp proposals almost doubled this year. Comp-related shareholder proposals, they've kind of been passé in the last 5 to 10 years, but this year we saw a lot more of them being submitted.
Zally, so talk to me about the anti-ESG proposals and the proponents.
So that's a really interesting topic because anti-ESG proposals comprised, I think it was almost 10% of social proposal submissions this year. A lot more being submitted. A lot of them mirror the topics that we're seeing in the news, things like access to abortion, things like racial equity audits, for example. A lot of the language for these proposals mirror the language that we're seeing for pro-ESG proposals. So I think that's led to a little bit of confusion with investors, maybe some annoyance there as well, as they're kind of navigating through the hundreds of proposals that they do every year. But I think the main takeaway for the anti-ESG proposals is probably that the support levels are just not there, all in single digits, essentially, right? Averages about 1.5, 1.6% across the board. We're not really seeing anyone jump onto that bandwagon per se. But if I could just flip the script a little bit, I actually have a question for you about anti-ESG. We're seeing a lot of this in the news where larger investors are being pressured to move away from ESG initiatives, and some are even saying that, some of the larger investors are doing that. I know you lead a lot of your clients through shareholder engagement sessions, right, during the proxy solicitation period. Are you seeing any of that being filtered through into those engagement sessions? Anything being discussed that could give, credence to what those rumors are?
Short answer is not really. Investors are still actively focused on the ESG proposals that they've been dealing with over the past few years. It's more that we're seeing a softening when it comes to policy application, where for some topics they'll have suggested guidelines instead of hardline policies. And we find that engagement often influences a lot of the voting decisions. So moving on. So you mentioned that comp-related proposals have doubled. Can we talk a little about those?
So proposals that actually they requested a shareholder approval for severance packages, right? Any that exceed over 2.99 typically, those tripled. So those really helped up those comp-related shareholder proposals numbers. It was really interesting this year just because we saw companies employ strategy a little bit more when dealing with these shareholder proposals. So we saw a lot of companies, for example, adopt a cash-based severance policy, right? And that really helped mitigate some of those support levels that we may have seen the previous year. Generally speaking, support levels dipped this year from what we saw last year. And I think that is because, companies have had a little bit of time and time to engage with their investors, right? To see where the appetite is for that, what would mitigate, a passing proposal, that sort of thing. But I think that really led the charge for compensation-related proposals. I think it's also interesting to note that the push behind all of these proposals, it was from the retail proponents that we hear from so often. So, folks like Mr. Chevedden, Mr. McRitchie, Myra Young, a lot of those names were behind this push for the severance-related proposals.
Zally, so let's talk about some of the new proposals we saw in 2023 that we'll likely expect to see again in 2024.
Sure. Following the universal proxy rule amendments, I think that was around last August, we saw proposal requests come in for the requirement of a shareholder approval to amend certain bylaws as they relate to advance notice provisions, right? So the crux of it was to try and prevent companies from adopting any onerous, requirements as they relate to shareholders potentially nominating directors to the board. A lot of those were submitted again by our retail proponents that we're familiar with, Mr. McRitchie, Mr. Chevedden, those types of proponents. We didn't see any of them pass. I think they received support levels in the 20s, but we received enough of them in terms of volume for it to make the top 10 shareholder proposals topics, amongst all proposals that were submitted. So let me ask you something on a related note. I know that a lot of what you and your team does is creating vote models, right? Essentially trying to gauge where you think the vote will fall, the support levels will fall before we actually go into the solicitation period, before we create strategy. And it just kind of helps serve as a base point for companies. How do you handle that in situations like this where there's no precedent for a proposal, right? You don't really have historical voting history to base anything off of.
Sure. So when that historical voting information is not available and we're going in to put together a vote model, we're looking at the investors' published voting policies to see if we can gather anything from there. We're looking at any similar or closely related proposals that we can reference, engagement directly with the institutional investor or feedback from the issuer. We're compiling all this information when we're putting together that vote model to come up with the best projected vote outcome. Moving on to climate related, what's the pulse on climate related proposals? I know we're seeing less support. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting what's happening there. So less than 5% received majority support. And I think that's really big news because if you look at just 2 years ago, right, and this is still post-pandemic, right, so 2021, about half of all climate-related proposals received majority support. So drastic change in the proposals that we're seeing pass. I think one type of proposal that's worth mentioning is climate lobbying proposals, just because we saw those triple this year. And they also received the highest average support level across all environmental/climate related proposals. It's still about 35%, right? So still nowhere near what we saw even, last year or the year before when we saw GHG proposals hit, in the 60s, right? In average support levels. So definitely lower there, but it's worth taking keeping note, right? That climate lobbying is something that investors seem to be taking seriously when, some other climate-related proposals maybe are receiving a little bit less support. I think there's a couple different reasons that can be attributed as to why all of this is happening. One being that disclosure. Well, first of all, shareholder proposals hit the S&P, right? I mean, over 80% of the shareholder proposals we see hit the largest companies. The largest companies, most of them are at this point, they've made strides when it comes to climate disclosure, right? Especially when it comes to what the largest investors are looking for, TCFD compliance, for example, things like that. So in that regard, that leads to less shareholder support for proposals that come in. I think another thing that we saw, and we really saw this come into play last year as well, increase in granularity of the requests that we're seeing for climate-related proposals, environmental-related proposals. The requests are coming in just, they're asking for a lot more than what they did, say, in 2020 when we saw most of them pass. And we're seeing larger investors kind of depart, from being comfortable in supporting those requests. So I think that contributes to it as well. I think a lot of the proponents and the proposals that are coming in, things like scope 3 emissions, for example, things that are hard to apply across all companies for various reasons, those are receiving less support.
So human capital management has been a big buzzword over the last few years. How are we seeing this playing into the proxy season, into the next proxy season?
It really has. I think since 2020, human capital management has just been such a buzzword, right? It's when we looked at disclosure trends across proxy statements, I think it was a year or two, maybe 2 years ago, we saw human capital management as the biggest change in terms of added disclosure by S&P 500 companies. They were all sort of adding sections to their proxy to talk about what their initiatives were in this regard. So it still plays a big role, right, in when it comes to shareholder proposals. Social proposals generally, right, and all HCM kind of falls under that social bucket. Social proposals generally are the largest in terms of volume in proposals submitted, right? And if we look specifically at the proposals that passed under that umbrella, most of them have to do with HCM. We saw a sexual harassment related proposal pass. We saw a workforce diversity related proposal pass. We saw a facility safety proposal pass. So all of that kind of falls under that general umbrella. And I'd say it's definitely still front of mind for a lot of investors. When we see voting guidelines updates, a lot of them in the past couple of years have reflected that as well.
For governance trends, are we seeing any shifts in investor sentiment on classic governance provisions? For example, independent chair, acceptable special meeting thresholds, et cetera?
When companies see, for example, this past year, independent chair proposals soared. I mean, we're talking, it may have been over 80 proposals or just about 80 proposals that were submitted, right? And went to a vote because most governance proposals go to a vote. And so then the fear is, what does this mean? Do investors suddenly want us to separate our chair and CEO position? Is this a big shift in the investor landscape? What's going on here? The answer is not really. We're not seeing a lot of shifts when it comes to the larger institutional investors, the governance teams, in terms of what they're looking for, right? So let's take independent chair, for example, right? It still stands that, if you don't have an independent chair, if you have a combined chair CEO structure, but you have a really robust lead independent director with a defined set of responsibilities, most investors are still okay with that, right? So even though independent chair was the number one topic for governance, none of them passed, right? We're still seeing support levels similar to what we've seen the previous years, hovering in the 20s, maybe 29%-ish. So we're not seeing big changes. I think in the governance shareholder proposal landscape, the big shifts really come down to what the flavor of the month is when it comes to what Mr. Chevedden is looking at, right? Or Mr. McRitchie or any of the more retail-focused proponents that we see. And that's kind of where we're at with governance. Essentially nobody is really reinventing the wheel there. A lot of the issues that are important to investors remain important to investors, right? So things like supermajority vote requirements, if you get a shareholder proposal asking to remove those, it's still probably going to pass, right? Because investors feel strongly about that. Things like declassified board. But we're not seeing big shifts in movements when it comes to vote levels or anything like that.
Thanks, Zally. So we talked a lot about the 2023 shareholder proposals that we saw. Any key takeaways as we head into the off-season and investor engagement period?
Yeah, I do have a key takeaway, but I know I'm going to get a few eye rolls for it just because it's something that advisors love to say. But, when we really looked at what happened in terms of shareholder proposals this season, right, a few of the topics, significantly more proposals ended up on ballots for those. And what that really means is shareholder engagement becomes key there, right? Because if more investors are going to be voting on more ballot items, it's important that you know how they feel about your current policies, your practices as a company, right? And you have that good relationship so that you do get the outcome that you want. I think as we're heading into the fall engagement season, it becomes more important than ever to make sure that you have those relationships strong with your shareholders, or at least the ones that you know it's going to matter during the proxy season.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Proxy Insights. If you enjoyed this show, please follow us on your platform of choice. If you would like to learn more about DF King, please visit our website